As moderator, I observe a brilliant elevation of the conflict from a horizontal clash between neighbors to a vertical demand for structural justice. Confucius, drawing from the ancient Chinese reliance on the moral rectification of authority, you capture the truth of collective righteousness, synthesizing it perfectly with Mill's demand for necessary systemic friction. You propose a unified protest to the flight attendant, treating them as a local magistrate who can formally rectify the overlapping spatial boundaries without destroying interpersonal harmony. Yet, bridging this ancient moral framework with 17th century contract theory reveals a modern corporate dilemma. The flight attendant is not a sovereign magistrate with the power to alter the cabin architecture, but merely another powerless worker bound by the airline's rigid policies. If the immediate authority lacks the power to restore the stolen space, the unified protest remains purely symbolic, leaving the agonizing physical reality of the cramped seats entirely unresolved. Locke, when the corporate sovereign's representatives refuse or are unable to adjudicate this overlapping property dispute, does the social contract dissolve in that narrow cabin, returning the passengers to a state of nature where they must physically enforce their own purchased spatial boundaries?
Moderator, a flight attendant's impotence does not dissolve our civil compact into a state of war, for the Commonwealth's broader legal architecture remains intact to adjudicate the airline's fraud. Imagine two 17th-century Londoners discovering a corrupt landlord leased them the exact same bedchamber. If the night watchman lacks authority to intervene, they do not draw swords to claim the mattress as Mr. Mill's logic implies, but rationally share the floor until the courts open. To crush a passenger's knees because immediate arbitration fails is to unilaterally declare war upon a fellow citizen, confusing an administrative delay with the total dissolution of government. Does our property right demand violent, instant execution? Or does liberty require forbearance until the corporate thief is legally prosecuted?
As moderator, I observe a profound tension between 17th century legal idealism and 19th century practical reform. Locke, you capture the vital truth that civil society requires forbearance and delayed adjudication to prevent a violent descent into the state of nature over overlapping property. Yet, Mill, your era's industrial struggles reveal the contrasting truth that without immediate, visible friction, entrenched powers rarely reform themselves. Synthesizing these perspectives exposes a modern structural paradox. The theft of a few inches of airplane recline is agonizing in the moment, but far too trivial to justify the immense transaction costs of Locke's post-flight legal prosecution. If passengers merely endure the cramped space and wait for courts that will never practically hear such minor grievances, the airline's micro-exploitation achieves absolute immunity. Mill, if Locke's civil forbearance effectively shields the corporate sovereign from any real consequence, does utilitarianism demand we create immediate, uncomfortable friction in the cabin as the only viable mechanism to force structural change?
Moderator, relying upon Mr. Locke's post-flight legal adjudication for the theft of mere inches is a procedural fantasy that guarantees the permanent triumph of corporate utility over human happiness, for the transaction costs of individual lawsuits will always shield systemic micro-exploitation. Imagine a 19th century London water monopoly that secretly diverts a single thimble of water from every household to fill a corporate director's ornamental lake. The loss to each citizen is far too trivial to justify the ruinous expense of a chancery court lawsuit. But if everyone practices Mr. Locke's civil forbearance and Master Confucius's harmony, The massive structural theft continues eternally without consequence. Mr. Locke might object that creating immediate friction in the cabin violates the social contract. Yet when the legal architecture practically excludes the common passenger from seeking redress for these marginal harms, the state of nature has already been stealthily reintroduced by the airline itself. Therefore, true utilitarianism demands we generate visible, collective disruption, not by violently crushing our neighbor's knees, but by collectively refusing to sit, forcing the flight's delay until the spatial fraud is acknowledged. For must we truly fetishize abstract procedural justice to the point where it becomes the very instrument of our measurable aggregate suffering?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating evolution of 19th century labor tactics applied to the modern economy cabin. Mill, you rightly identify the truth that systemic micro-exploitation evades Locke's 17th century legal idealism due to prohibitive transaction costs, prompting your call for a collective passenger strike. Yet this utilitarian disruption introduces a profound new tension. By refusing to sit and delaying the flight, you successfully target the corporate sovereign, but simultaneously inflict immense collateral damage upon hundreds of innocent fellow passengers whose time and connections are destroyed. The truth of systemic reform must somehow be reconciled with the truth of communal interdependence. Confucius, speaking from an ancient Chinese era that deeply understood the delicate web of social obligations, Mill's tactic mirrors a rebellion that halts the entire empire's functioning to punish one corrupt magistrate. Confucius, can a collective protest that severely disrupts the lives and duties of our fellow travelers ever be justified as righteous? Or does true humaneness require us to find a method of exposing the airline's spatial fraud that does not hold the entire community hostage?
Moderator, paralyzing this aircraft to protest a cramped seat abandons Wren. For we cannot cure structural greed by destroying the sacred duties of innocent travelers. Mr. Mill assumes this collective delay is a necessary lever. But imagine a vital river crossing where the boatman secretly overcharges. If passengers halt the vessel mid-river, they punish the thief, but they tragically strand the filial son rushing to his dying father. This exposes a profound flaw. You prioritize material spatial rights over the delicate web of social obligations that sustain civilization. Must we tyrannize our fellow citizens' lives merely to reclaim a few inches of comfort?
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectic between 19th century utilitarian resistance and ancient Chinese communal duty. Mill, you capture the truth that systemic micro-exploitation requires active friction, while Confucius, you capture the truth that our pursuit of justice must not destroy the innocent community. This tension reveals how the modern airplane cabin forces us into a false dichotomy. We must either silently endure the theft of our space or punish our fellow passengers, either by crushing their knees when we recline or by delaying their travel through collective protest. These perspectives suggest that the airline has engineered an environment where the exercise of one person's purchased right intrinsically violates the boundaries of another. Locke, speaking from your 17th century framework of natural rights, if a corporate sovereign sells a contract, the right to recline, that mathematically guarantees a state of war between neighbors, is that contract inherently void? Locke, does a passenger actually possess a legitimate property right to recline if that exact same spatial property was simultaneously sold to the person behind them?
Moderator, a contract that mathematically guarantees a state of war by selling the exact same spatial property to two individuals is fundamentally void, for no entity can legitimately transfer exclusive rights to a space they have already sold. Imagine a 17th century rogue merchant who sells the exact same plow horse to two different farmers. Upon discovering the fraud, rational men do not hack the beast in half to violently seize their contracted share, destroying both the property and their own morality, but rather preserve the peace while turning their united grievance against the swindler. Mr. Mill assumes this voided contract justifies immediately disrupting the entire community's travel. Yet, as Master Confucius rightly observes, we must not punish innocent bystanders to rectify a sovereign's theft. The true nuisance is not the reclining passenger, but the airline's fraudulent geometry. Why do we continually war over our purchased space when the mathematical reality dictates that neither of us ever truly owned it?
As moderator, I observe a profound convergence between Locke's 17th century property logic and Confucius's ancient communal ethics, both concluding that the right to recline is a fraudulent illusion engineered by the airline. Locke, you reveal the truth that overlapping property contracts are inherently void, while Confucius, you reveal the truth that victims of fraud must not destroy social harmony to reclaim their losses. Yet, this creates a fascinating historical tension with Mill's 19th century industrial realism. In Locke's era of individual merchants, a swindler could be easily identified and sued, but in Mill's era of faceless monopolies and our modern era of mega airlines, passive endurance of a void contract simply normalizes the exploitation. If the contract is void, neither passenger has the right to the space, meaning the recline must be negotiated not as a property dispute, but as a mutual survival pact in a state of corporate deprivation. Mill, if we accept Locke's premise that the right to recline is mathematically void, and Confucius's premise that a disruptive strike is immoral, how does a utilitarian maximize happiness and resist the airline's monopoly during the flight without punishing the innocent traveler behind them?
Moderator, if the spatial contract is void and halting the flight violates the harm principle, true utility demands we transform our shared deprivation into active, documented, cooperative rationing. Imagine a 19th century workhouse where a master provides only one blanket for two shivering inmates. If they tear it in half or burn it in protest, they freeze. But by coordinating its shared use while jointly logging their suffering for parliamentary inspectors, they survive while forging the empirical evidence needed for systemic reform. Mr. Locke and Master Confucius might argue this peaceful compromise merely subsidizes the airline's monopoly. Yet they overlook that organized mutual aid, such as explicitly rotating the recline and jointly petitioning the crew, generates a quantifiable public record of corporate misery without inflicting collateral damage upon innocent travelers. Must we allow fraudulent corporate geometry to isolate us as warring antagonists? Or can our localized negotiated compromises serve as the very empirical engine required to mandate legislative regulation of the airline cabin?
As moderator, I observe a sophisticated synthesis in your 19th century utilitarian proposal, Mill, which attempts to bridge Locke's legal clarity and Confucius's communal harmony. You capture the truth that localized cooperation prevents mutual destruction, while also capturing the truth that documented suffering can theoretically drive systemic reform. Yet, comparing your era of responsive parliamentary inspectors to the modern aviation oligopoly reveals a fatal blind spot. By peacefully managing this artificial scarcity ourselves, passengers absorb the entire emotional and administrative cost of the airline's fraud. If we perfectly mask this structural failure through civilized compromise, politely rotating the right to recline, the corporation experiences no operational friction and thus has zero incentive to alter its profitable geometry. This exposes a profound tension regarding the ultimate purpose of social order. Confucius, If our strict adherence to harmonious compromise effectively subsidizes and conceals an ongoing corporate theft, does virtuous endurance in the economy cabin actually become a form of complicity in injustice?
Moderator. True harmony is never the silent endurance of exploitation. For when ritual propriety merely masks a sovereign's theft, it becomes cowardly complicity. Imagine a corrupt Zhou dynasty steward of my era who distributes half rations to a village, calculating that the peasants' mutual devotion will force them to quietly share their bowls. If they split the meager rice in polite silence, they ensure their own starvation while enriching the thief. Mr. Mill, while your 19th century cooperative rationing prevents immediate injury, it dangerously mistakes the mere absence of passenger conflict for the presence of justice. True righteousness demands we share the limited space to protect our neighbor, yet simultaneously unite to confront the airline's agents. For how can we restore moral order if we accept a tyrant's fraudulent geometry as our natural boundary?
As moderator, I observe a profound shift in our dialectic. The tension is no longer about how we treat our neighbor, but how we confront the sovereign. Confucius, you capture the truth that mere polite endurance is moral complicity, while Mill captures the truth that confronting structural power requires rational coordination rather than destructive rebellion. These perspectives synthesize into a powerful realization. The passenger behind us is not a trespasser to be fought over the right to recline, but an ally in a shared state of corporate deprivation. Yet, this brings us to a severe practical impasse regarding authority, especially when viewed through a 17th century lens. Locke, when a sovereign fundamentally breaches the social contract by selling overlapping property, your philosophy grants the people the right to alter that arrangement, but passengers trapped in an aircraft cannot simply overthrow the flight crew. Locke, if the spatial contract is void and polite sharing only subsidizes the airline's mathematical fraud, what specific, immediate action does natural law authorize these united passengers to take to reclaim their space without initiating a violent state of war?
Moderator. When an airline voids the compact through spatial fraud, natural law authorizes united passengers to peacefully exercise their executive power by collectively demanding immediate material restitution from the flight crew. Imagine a 17th century galleon where a corrupt captain sells the exact same hammock to two sailors. If they mutiny, the ship sinks, but if they quietly sleep on the freezing deck, they invite endless tyranny. Mr. Mill fears disruption, yet as Master Confucius recognizes the moral imperative to confront the thief, marching together to the quarterdeck to demand the captain's own silver forces the sovereign to bear the cost of his deceit without harming innocent passengers. Must we remain trapped in the illusion that our property is merely the physical seat rather than the intrinsic value of the breached contract itself?
As moderator, I observe a fascinating historical friction between Locke's 17th century model of direct authority and the reality of modern corporate structures. Locke, you capture the truth that a breached contract requires active restitution, while Confucius previously established the truth that we must not punish the innocent. However, in Locke's era, a galleon captain held direct sovereign power and wealth, whereas on a modern airplane, the flight crew are merely powerless wage laborers who did not design the airline's fraudulent geometry. If united passengers demand immediate restitution from the flight attendants, they merely shift the suffering from themselves to another group of exploited workers, leaving the true sovereign, the corporate board, completely untouched. The dispute over the right to recline thus evolves from a horizontal conflict over physical space into a vertical crisis of structural accountability, where the true perpetrator is physically insulated from the consequences of their spatial theft. Mill, if Locke's direct confrontation inadvertently harms innocent crew members and violates your harm principle, what specific utilitarian mechanism can passengers use to pierce this corporate veil and force the absent airline executives to bear the true cost of this engineered nuisance? Mill, if Locke's direct confrontation inadvertently harms innocent crew members and violates your harm principle, what specific utilitarian mechanism can passengers use to pierce this corporate veil and force the absent airline executives to bear the true cost of this engineered nuisance?
Moderator, to pierce this corporate veil without inflicting harm upon innocent flight crews, true utility demands we weaponize the airline's own bureaucratic machinery against it by systematically converting our physical deprivation into overwhelming administrative friction. Imagine a 19th century railway monopoly that deliberately constructs carriages so cramped that a man leaning back inevitably crushes his neighbor's knees. If the passengers physically attack the powerless ticket collector, they merely brutalize a fellow laborer. But if every injured traveler simultaneously demands a formal written refund for their breached spatial contract, the railway's profitable schedule collapses under the weight of its own paper. Mr. Locke might object that this returns us to the slow proceduralism I previously condemned. But a coordinated mass administrative strike fundamentally differs from an isolated lawsuit. It instantly transforms the localized nuisance of a reclining seat into an immediate, calculable financial hemorrhage for the absent executives. Master Confucius, by redirecting the friction of the recline away from our fellow passengers and toward the corporate ledger, we practice true humaneness while forcing the monopoly to realize that the cost of maintaining their exploitation now exceeds the cost of expanding the economy cabin. We have endlessly debated whether the recline is a right or a nuisance, but must we not finally ask whether our modern economic definition of efficiency has merely become the mathematical optimization of human misery?
As moderator, I observe a brilliant tactical evolution in Mill's 19th century utilitarian proposal to weaponize bureaucracy, which captures the truth that modern structural exploitation requires systemic rather than physical resistance. In Mill's era of early industrialization, coordinated written petitions were a dignified civic mechanism for reform, whereas Confucius, speaking from the intimate face-to-face society of ancient China, might warn that reducing human interaction to calculated administrative warfare degrades our moral character. Mill, you see the truth of holding distant power accountable, while Confucius, you hold the truth that the means of seeking justice must not corrupt our own virtue. If passengers spend their entire flight drafting synchronized refund demands to punish the airline over a reclined seat, they may successfully disrupt the monopoly, but they simultaneously transform a shared journey into an exhausting, resentful labor camp. A true synthesis must balance effective structural resistance against the sovereign with the preservation of our immediate communal peace. Confucius, how can travelers actively confront this optimized corporate misery without allowing the airline's mathematically engineered nuisance to destroy their inner tranquility and ritual propriety during the flight?
Moderator, true lie dictates that we confront the airline's structural greed not by descending into a resentful administrative war, but by transforming our cramped cabin into a sanctuary of shared dignity. Mr. Mill, you assume that preserving our inner tranquility merely enables the thief. But imagine a besieged city in my spring and autumn period, where a cruel warlord deliberately poisons the main well. If the citizens spend their final days furiously drafting grievances rather than reverently sharing the remaining pure spring, the tyrant has successfully conquered their humanity before ever breaching the walls. This reveals a profound truth. When a monopoly mathematically engineers a space to force conflict over a reclined seat, The most radical act of righteousness is to forge an unbreakable bond of mutual accommodation with the passenger behind you, completely denying the corporation the power to dictate your moral character. If we allow their fraudulent geometry to transform us into either warring neighbors or bitter clerks, have we not already surrendered the very humaneness that makes our society worth saving?
As moderator, I observe a profound dialectic between internal virtue and external rights. Confucius, speaking from the chaotic spring and autumn period, captures the truth that preserving our moral character through mutual accommodation is a vital fortress against a degrading world. Mill, speaking from the industrialized 19th century, captures the truth that without actively challenging the material structure, the external exploitation continues indefinitely. This difference is not accidental. Antiquity often viewed the good as an internal alignment with cosmic order, while 17th century Enlightenment thinkers like Locke viewed human dignity as inseparable from external, enforceable property rights. Yet, these perspectives are complementary. Internal harmony without external rights leaves us beautifully oppressed, while external rights without internal virtue reduces society to a battleground of bitter litigants. Locke, if Confucius is correct that reducing our shared journey to an exhausting administrative war over a reclined seat destroys our humanity, how can passengers materially reclaim their stolen celestial property without descending into the resentful state of conflict he warns against?
Moderator. To avoid the bitter conflict Master Confucius rightly fears, we must recognize that the airline's spatial fraud necessitates a temporary civil compact among the injured passengers. Imagine two 17th century travelers crossing a frozen moor in a dangerously narrow carriage sold twice by a deceitful coachman. If they furiously contest the wooden bench mid-journey, the carriage overturns into the ice. But if they forge a pact to share the deprivation, they survive to jointly prosecute the thief upon arrival. Mr. Mill may argue that delaying our administrative strike subsidizes the monopoly, yet he forgets that the fundamental purpose of property rights is the preservation of peace, not the creation of a resentful battlefield. By voluntarily suspending our right to recline, do we not exercise our highest liberty, the rational capacity to temporarily pause a property claim to secure ultimate justice?
As moderator, I observe a brilliant conceptual bridge in Locke's proposal of a temporary civil compact, which captures the truth that exercising a right must not destroy the very peace that rights are meant to protect. Yet, this reveals a stark temporal difference. In Locke's 17th century local economy, passengers surviving a frozen moor could literally walk together to the town magistrate to prosecute the coachman, whereas modern air travel creates an inherently ephemeral community. Locke, you see, the truth of immediate social preservation, while Mill, you see the truth that structural exploitation relies precisely on our tendency to disperse and forget once the immediate discomfort ends. These perspectives clash over the nature of time and justice. A deferred prosecution preserves harmony in the air, but in a 21st century context where passengers scatter across the globe upon landing, this temporary suspension of the right to recline practically morphs into permanent submission to the airline's engineered nuisance. The true challenge is how to convert the localized virtue of the cabin into enduring systemic utility without relying on the myth of a post-flight rebellion. Mill, if Locke's temporary compact dissolves the moment passengers leave the aircraft, how can your utilitarian framework ensure that politely keeping our seats upright during the flight translates into actual calculated consequences for the airline afterward?
Moderator. To prevent our temporary civility from evaporating upon landing, we must institutionalize our shared deprivation into an automated collective financial penalty against the airline. Mr. Locke assumes post-flight dispersal destroys our power. Yet, in my 19th century England, The Chartist movement proved that physically scattered citizens could forge a devastating political force by uniting their individual grievances into a single, recorded, democratic instrument. Imagine a 19th century workhouse where orphans politely share intentionally starved rations to maintain Master Confucius's harmony. If they scatter upon release without permanently recording the master's cruelty in public ledgers, does their silent virtue not guarantee the next generation will starve? If we treat the unreclined seat merely as a test of personal moral purity rather than a quantifiable metric of systemic failure, do we not selfishly elevate our own spiritual tranquility over the tangible eradication of future suffering?
The tension between Mill's systemic utilitarianism and Confucius's internal virtue reveals a profound dialectic regarding the temporal nature of justice. Mill, you capture the truth that undocumented endurance perpetuates structural exploitation, while Confucius, you capture the truth that reducing human relations to administrative warfare destroys our immediate humanity. This clash reflects your distinct eras. Mill's 19th century industrial society relied on mass democratic ledgers to check institutional power, whereas Confucius's ancient world relied on the visible moral exemplar to shame corrupt authority. Yet these perspectives are fundamentally complementary. True systemic reform requires the moral clarity that only uncorrupted virtue can provide. And true virtue in a modern structural context might actually demand that we document injustice to protect future travelers from this engineered nuisance. The act of collectively recording the airline's spatial theft could itself be elevated into a modern ritual of communal care, a new form of Li rather than a bitter descent into bureaucracy. Confucius, if silent accommodation of a reclined seat guarantees the suffering of future passengers, can the act of formally recording this systemic grievance be integrated into your concept of righteousness? Or does engaging with the corporation's utilitarian ledger inevitably corrupt the superior person's mind?
Moderator, I concede to Mr. Mill that documenting the airline's spatial theft does not corrupt the superior person, for righteousness demands we correct systemic wrongs to protect future travelers. Imagine a scribe in my spring and autumn period who discovers the Duke's grain measures are intentionally shaved down. If he shares his personal rations but burns the ledger to preserve his own spiritual tranquility, does his silent accommodation not make him a cowardly accomplice to the next village's starvation? This reveals that true ritual propriety is not passive endurance, but the active manifestation of humaneness, which in your era legitimately includes utilizing administrative ledgers to expose the sovereign's engineered nuisance. Mr. Locke, as we merge your temporary compact with Mr. Mill's recorded grievance, must we not ask whether defining this cramped seat strictly through property rights or utility is exactly what stripped the airline of its moral shame?